Grace and peace to you. I wanted to make a short little video here reviewing our exercise on redaction criticism that was looking at the transfiguration of Jesus. There was some lack of clarity on exactly what's involved with that, and so I want to sort of walk you through the process that I go through when I'm looking at redaction criticism and highlight the sort of things you really want to be looking at. The specifics and how you would go about making decisions about how the redaction or editing actually worked. When doing redaction criticism, it's of course best to start with the Greek instead of the English, and you can see I've got that here, and again I've done the highlighting system, and again there's the degree to which you want to be perfect about it or fussy about it is somewhat subjective, but even if you don't know the Greek here right now or aren't looking at that, what you can still see are make quite a few observations just by looking at the colors that you see here. Now remember, Mark here is our center column, and our presumption is, and I believe this is a good one we can count on, is that both Matthew and Luke used Mark. Okay, so there's your one source. And what we can see here then, just by looking at this, that all this that's in the dark black, the bold black, is stuff that Mark had that Matthew and Luke used. That's where all three are the same. So we can see our basic story is pretty set here. After some days, Jesus takes along three of his disciples and they go up a mountain. There's your basic story right there. Now what we do notice here is all this stuff in purple is stuff that Matthew took from Mark. And so in Matthew here, if you look at this, everything that's in purple and the bold black, that's pretty much taken directly from Mark. And the only interesting stuff that Matthew has done is he's added this business about in the red here, which would be about his brother. When we look over here at Luke, again, what we see here just by noticing the color is that he's done quite a bit of free diagramming here, or free reworking of the text with all this that's in yellow. So he's got the bold, and then everything else in yellow is stuff that Luke has done on his own. Now, where we look in the big picture of other things that we find interesting then is instances where Matthew and Luke agree over against Mark. And we see here these parts in orange right here. There's just a few little things. We'll see more further down in a moment. Those are the things that Matthew and Luke didn't get from Mark. And so that's the issue, is did they get it from the Q source, if you believe, follow the 2 or 4 source hypothesis, or if you're following the FAR hypothesis, that you would say this is an instance where Luke had both Mark and Matthew in front of him, and that's why we see Matthew's influence here on Mark. And that can be a judgment call we'll talk about later. Now, what I've done is I have made a English translation that's quite literal with this, so that we can make these comparisons here and see more clearly what's going on. So I'll take these one at a time, and we see here that Matthew is followed very closely in Mark in this section A here, and just has added his brother, perhaps for clarification. When we get to Luke, there's a couple things that we notice. First of all, Luke notes that it's 8 days instead of 6. Now, why would Luke make a change like that? Are these numbers symbolic in some way? Now, the 6th day in a Jewish week would be Friday. Friday is the day of crucifixion. Matthew and Mark, they have no other reason for referring to 6 days later. 6 days later than what? It was this confession that Peter made about Jesus and Jesus' first passion prediction. So maybe it's trying to allude to the 6 days here, that this is the crucifixion, and we're going to see something perhaps about the resurrection here in the Transfiguration. Now, that Luke would go to 8 days then is clearly something that he has gotten neither from Mark nor from Matthew. And here's where I would do a word study, trying to find out where 8 is that a symbolic number in Luke that he wants to pay attention to, or is this a symbolic number in the Old Testament? We might find something I have in other notes that might be from Exodus or Leviticus, where they're talking about some kind of revelation of God's glory with that. That's possible. let's continue on. In part B here, both Matthew and Luke talk about Jesus being transfigured. And before I jumped ahead here, I'll go back to part A. The other important thing about Luke here is that he added this detail about that Jesus went up the mountain to pray. And here's where I would want to say, where does this come from? I would again do a word search in Luke, and we find that prayer is a very important concern in Luke, and that appears that's something he's added here at this point. Now, in this next one then, as I said, we got to transfigured, and it uses the word metamorphao, which is a change of form, transfigured, change of figure that way. And Luke mentions it a little bit differently. He ties it into the praying, and that he talks about his appearance of his face changed, or othered is the Greek that's behind it here. Now, Matthew also makes a reference to Jesus's face, and he adds that detail that it shone like the sun, which is an interesting sort of thing here. And here's where I would go do a word search and see, is there something going on in Matthew with that? And we do find in Matthew 13:43, Jesus talks about the righteous will shine like the sun. So perhaps it's making a allusion to that. All of them do have something about his clothes becoming white in some way, right? So we see that they use different formulations with that. And then Matthew is going to add white as the light, which is an interesting sort of thing here. Luke uses a very interesting term I've rendered with gleaming to get to that description. And why didn't they use Mark here? He's got sort of and again, I'm trying to be somewhat close to Mark. He uses a dazzling super white, more than any bleach on earth can whiten. I suppose that bleaching business, the fuller on earth, might not be particularly attractive to them to make that comparison, but they're all getting at this in one way to try to explain what's going on with Jesus's clothing there. And again, we can do word searches on all these things, trying to find out what each gospel author has in mind here. I'm just thinking at this point they thought that bleach on earth can whiten was sort of mundane, and it's much more attractive to describe it as white as light instead here, or to use this very special word of gleaming white that Luke uses. Now in part C here, we're going to get an interesting thing. Both Matthew and Luke add a behold, an idu in there, and it's odd that they would both add it, and it's not in Mark, who would usually tend to prefer that word. Again, I would do a search on idu and how it works in all three Gospels. A further study, I would look at all the instances of Mark where he uses idu, and do Matthew and Luke regularly keep it, omit it? So this one's a little odd because usually they do not add it. So this is one of, if there was any evidence, slim as it is, that I would say, well, maybe Matthew is looking at, Luke is looking at Matthew at this point, that he would include that. Now, we have the order of the three. The three of them are there, right? Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. They have a slightly different way of ordering them. Mark had said Elijah with Moses. Matthew had said Moses and Elijah. That is also repeated in Luke there. And they're talking, all of them that are talking there, that in that appearance. And then once again, we've got this special little detail in Luke here that's added on, that they appeared in glory and were talking about his departure, which he was going to accomplish in Jerusalem. Now, the word for departure here is actually the exodos. Exodus is the same word that's used for the book of the Old Testament in the Greek there. So it's interesting that he's using that word and tying into that history. They also here, though, I would note that this is bringing the attention of our Transfiguration account to Jerusalem, that even here now we're looking ahead at Jerusalem, and in Luke we will discover that Jerusalem is the key point around which the whole sort of story rotates and is framed in the Gospel of Luke. So that's an important thing for him to add. We see next here, though, that Luke is adding this whole section right through here, this whole yellow thing, and it's partly makes total sense, because if you're reading in Mark here and it says they were talking with Jesus, here's where it's like inquiring minds want to know, right? What were they talking about? This would be of tremendous interest, and here Luke is answering that question for us. So for me at this point, as I'm reading this seems to me a natural addition that Luke has seen this business of talking, and he's added the information about going to Jerusalem, and then Luke has to provide this explanation in some way that the Peter and the ones were way down with sleep, but since they'd stay awake, which sounds odd, it's trying to describe this middle state, they saw his glory, which remember he'd picked up here, so this part of glory is important, and the two men who stood with him. So Luke, in framing this, has added weight to the second section right here, as you can see, and tries to draw our attention to this by expanding the story. Let me pause here for just a second. So we continue on here, and in our next section we can once again see that Peter emerges. The story is very similar. Peter emerges, he makes this statement, "It is good that we are here," and offers to make the 3 shrines. You can see that in the black, that's in all of them there. So that is very clear that the story is functioning the same here. Now, slightly different wording when Peter responded that we see Matthew and Mark share, and Luke changes it that happened as they were departing from him. But the more interesting thing is the word that is used that the gospel authors record in order to talk about the different titles used for Jesus here. Matthew, well, let's start with Mark. Mark has rabbi, okay? So what I would again do here with this is I'd be looking through each of the gospels and see how do they use these terms. Mark regularly uses this, rabbi, literally my great one, is an honorific term used for one's teacher. But why does Matthew change to Lord, Kurios, instead of Ravi? Here's where, if you did a word study, you will see that Matthew does not like to use that title Rabbi for Jesus. It's apparently in his community, of Matthew's community, it's a term of contention, and Jesus says they're using that term, and it's not one to be applied to Jesus. In fact, the only person who calls Jesus Rabbi in Matthew is Judas, you would find, and that can't be a good thing, right? So Lord is a regular title, and so I'm seeing here, and it makes perfect sense to me, that when Matthew came across Mark's rabbi, he changed it to Lord. Now, Luke here uses master, epistates, as a term instead, and this is, again, I would look through this, it's a very, it's an honorific term here, and it's picking up the idea of honorific title that would work for a Hellenized audience, that would prefer that as compared to a Jewish term, rabbi. So I'm thinking this works better in a Hellenized context, and that explains the context here. Now, when we see that we have the next change here, we see by this green, which is telling us Mark and Luke are using the same thing here, and Peter says, "Let us make." And the us here apparently is referring to at least the other 2 disciples with him. We see here in Matthew, however, a nice little change. If you wish, so he's, I will make. Okay, so here Peter is getting a little bit of an upgrade here. First of all, recognizing Jesus' wishes, and then also planning to do it himself rather than including the other disciples here. And we can confirm that this is somewhat of an upgrade when we also see here that Mark had continued on, for he didn't know how he should respond. It's trying to explain Peter's response here, which seems to be a poor response here, that he would do this. We see that Luke preserved that as well. He didn't know what he was saying. And clearly here Matthew is upgrading Peter. He doesn't know, it's not that way that he didn't know, but he's deferring to Jesus' wishes and makes this a much more a claim, that a statement that Peter makes that is less negative for him. Now, as we continue on in the part B here, Mark points out that they were all afraid. Okay. Now, what we see here is that Luke is going to pick that up here, and the Mark connects the fear back to the transfiguration part. So notice here the fear is going here. In Luke, the fear happens when this cloud came and overshadowed them. So both Mark and Luke have the fear, but they've switched the order of when the fear occurs. And what we see here is even further down here. Matthew has transferred the fear down to the next section. So the disciples heard this, the voice speaking, and they feared greatly. So we see here they're all dealing with recognizing that the disciples feared. Mark, they fear because of simply the transfiguration. Luke, they fear when they enter this cloud which overshadows them. And in Matthew, they fear as a result of hearing this voice. So all three of them pick it up, but are picking up different nuances of it. Now, they have this cloud overshadowing. They all have that there. They entered the cloud, which is picking up some interesting details from Exodus. We did a search from that. And then we've got this the voice that came from the cloud, and the voice that came from the cloud should remind us back of the baptism scenes in each of these Gospels here, which is where we had a very similar statement about Jesus being the beloved Son. Now, what we notice here is interesting on this is Mark and Matthew have the beloved Son, which is picking up stuff from Genesis 22, Psalm 2, that we saw in the baptism, but Luke has changed that to the chosen one. And here there's a long chain that we could work out, but what's actually going on here is this well-pleasing part is coming from Isaiah 42. That Matthew has picked up here, the well-pleased, which we had heard back in the baptism scene here. And what Luke has done is he's gone to this Isaiah 42 passage, and that's where we find that the designation is also given as a chosen one. So both Matthew and Luke are actually picking up the same thing in different ways from Isaiah 42:1. And here now they all three include to listen to him, but that's from picking up an addition from the baptism scene, but it's picking up from Deuteronomy 18:15, which is a story, Deuteronomy 18:15, which is picking up Moses's declaration that to replace him, God will send them a prophet like him, prophet like Moses, and that the people are to listen to him. So it's hinting at this. And so we see here this, remember that was Moses. We've got Moses in this scene here. It's like I had one professor said, all the Christmas lights are being turned on here in a way of Moses and Elijah and Jesus and Transfiguration, and hinting at passion and resurrection, and all these things are coming together. Finally, in this last section, the only thing that really is shared between them is that Jesus is alone at the end. Luke simplifies the story greatly. Matthew expands it here tremendously by responding to their fear, where he touches them and says, "Arise, do not be afraid." And they lift up their eyes. They saw no one except Jesus himself. So there's my dealing with redaction criticism, and you can see where I'm looking very closely at the wording changes that each of the gospel authors are making. And in order to determine these changes that they're making, I am looking within their gospels, looking within scripture, saying, now why would you do this? Why would you make these changes? Now, one last thing here we'll note, I asked that question, is this show anything about Q source, or that Matthew was that Luke was using Matthew? Now, for one, I'm not anticipating the Q source being used here, because that tends to be, for the most part, sayings of Jesus. They don't really include much in the way of narratives, so I wouldn't have expected to find a transfiguration story in there. And if that's the case, then I'm looking at these little agreements. They're not major agreements, but his face, the beholds, the while he was saying, they're minor agreements, but that you would have those agreements all leads me to think that, well, maybe this is the case that would support the Farrer hypothesis. Okay, hope that helped.